Hello, everyone. Welcome to a very special interview here with Arbury Road. I've been joined by Professor Boris Vormann, who is the Professor of Politics and Director of the Political Concentration at Bard College in Berlin. Thank you very much for joining us, Professor Vormann.
Well, thanks so much for having me.
It's our pleasure. Right, let's dive right in. So, last week we spoke a bit on the podcast about the US, and given your expertise, I'd like to continue that theme, that line of questions today. So, Biden is in, Trump is gone. First question is, do we expect to see any genuine progressivism from the Biden administration? Is he going to just sit back and relax knowing that he couldn't, hopefully, be as bad a president as Trump? Or is he going to push for the real change that the likes of us would like to see in the States?
Well, I mean, it looks from the first couple of weeks like he's really hitting the road running. Many people on the left have criticized how Biden was perhaps too much of a continuation of the Obama era. Many holdovers, many people who were part of that establishment that was criticized at the time, and some would say rightly so. But it seems like, I mean, one of the advantages has been that these people know the institutions, they know who to talk to, and they know the mechanisms. So they seem to have been pretty fast at getting started. How far this will reach, no one knows yet. And of course, the majorities in the Senate are razor thin. And even Obama, who had much more of a majority at the time in 2008, wasn't able to pull it off very easily. Certain major policy projects like the Recovery Act, but also, of course, Obamacare. So he's in a tough spot, and we're seeing that the Republicans are still regrouping behind Trump. They're still protecting him in the impeachment process. I don't think that we're going to see an impeachment or a conviction in the Senate. So he's up for some struggle, and I think he's right to use the honeymoon phase and use the time, the first year or so, to be aggressive about his policies, because after 2 years' time, when the midterm elections come, it might already be over.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a key moment we'll all be looking forward to with anticipation, the midterms in a couple of years. So you touched on Biden hitting the ground running. Now, he's made a lot of executive orders in the first week. Which of those have jumped out at you as being absolutely essential moving forward? Or were there any that surprised you, that you were pleasantly surprised by maybe?
I'm somewhat surprised by the complexity of the endeavor. I mean, one of the big advantages that Biden has is that Trump, like Obama before him, was just able to rule through executive orders. I mean, the major legislative initiative of Trump's was the tax reform. But other than that, there's not much that he did, and not much of a policy legacy that he created that Biden wouldn't be able to easily repeal. So, but I think the crises, it's not that you could just speak of one crisis. I mean, there's so many different things going on at the same time that it's even difficult to put a label on it. And that's one of the things that I'm surprised about. It's difficult to actually brand the kind of policy change that Biden is envisioning. Sometimes it seems like he's leaning into the climate change debate without calling the policies the Green New Deal, because he doesn't want to look from the right as though he was being hijacked by the so-called far left in the US. Then it looks more like there's an equity agenda, an equality agenda. The last couple of days have been more about this. Then immigration policies that have been changed around. So there's no major surprises, I think, in terms of the executive orders. I think most of them have been about restoring a certain continuity in American politics that was before Trump even shared by the Republicans. I think Trump is, after all, an outlier in his politics. But the big question is, and I think this is also what your first question was pointing to, is Biden simply a restoration of the status quo ante? Is he going back to Obama-Clinton type post-Cold War neoliberal politics? Or does he see the need for a deeper going reform that also addresses the factors that have ultimately led to Trumpism? Trump and to Trumpism, I'd say, even on a global level. I think many of the factors, even though they are context specific, are very much tied to this neoliberal agenda of the 1980s, 1990s, 2000s. So yeah, I think this is the big question, and it's too early to tell. I think we will see only in a year's time or so, or 2 years' time, which of these proposals have carried water, basically.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so keeping with that line of whether or not we're going to just revert to neoliberalism, are they going to try and enact some progressive policies? How do you see Kamala Harris playing a role in all of this? Because Kamala Harris's appointment as VP is undeniably historic. She's the first Black woman, the first woman of Asian descent to hold the role. And people, I think a lot of people seem to think that for these reasons, Kamala Harris is particularly progressive. Would you share that view? Do you think she'll be a positive progressive reinforcement for the administration? Or is she just another one of the politicians, you know, the neoliberals?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I'm unsure about it at this point. Maybe it's too early to pass a judgment. I mean, if you look at her record in California as an attorney general, also as a senator, I mean, she has been criticized also from the left for being too harsh at times when it comes to education policy, when it comes to the criminal justice system and the policies she was pushing at the time. So she's sometimes even seen as a conservative from that angle. On the other hand, yes, I mean, at this point, this is mostly about symbolism, but important symbolism nonetheless, right? It is important that women and minority groups come into leading positions. So there's no doubt about that. But to really judge her impact on the administration, it's too early to tell. We shouldn't also forget that the vice president has a rather ceremonial role for the most part. I mean, Joe Biden is known for having been the last one in the room. I mean, this is what's always been emphasized in his campaign also, that he had some influence, especially when it comes to foreign policy, on Obama's thinking. But it's not always so, right? So it could be this more ceremonial role after all. But Biden is very old, and you know, God forbid. But of course, there's a potential that she might have to step in at some point, and she needs to be ready for that. So I think she will be quite engaged. But to what extent she will be able to actually have a heavy impact on the administration is too soon to tell.
Yeah, absolutely. So you touched on Kamala Harris maybe having an impact in terms of foreign policy, and that's the next topic I'd like to steer us towards. So since Trump has come into office, China really have emerged as a true 21st century superpower. Now, how has this, not just the new status of China, if you will, in the worldview, but also the perception of the USA has changed pretty dramatically in the West, certainly here in Europe. How do you see these two factors combining, and what should we expect to see in terms of US, China, that power struggle over the next number of years?
I mean, in foreign policy circles and in international relations studies, China has for a long time been seen as a rising hegemon. I mean, this discussion reaches back quite a while, at least until the 1990s. But there's even a discussion about the role of China in international politics in the early 20th century and late 19th century even. So it's an ongoing debate, but it's correct. I mean, I think one thing that Trump has underestimated, and maybe many people in the IR circles have underestimated, was the importance of soft power in terms of stabilizing American dominance in the world. How important it was that, you know, we in Europe liked to watch TV series from the US and had admired the athletes in the US and so on and so forth. So this gives a lot of legitimacy to power, obviously. It's not very direct, it's not very causal, it's very difficult to measure in quantitative terms. But it's important to stabilize power. And I think Trump, with his zero-sum, hardcore realist perspective on IR, has undermined this potential. Now, I think what Biden will try to do is to portray this as an aberration from the true path of American dominance as, you know, trying to protect democracy in the world and spread freedom in the world and so on and so forth. But it's not going to be that easy. Yes, China has grown more important. I mean, the One Belt, One Road initiative has been pushed heavily in the last couple of years and is expanding its material power and capacities as a state. But it's also not easy for the US to restore its credibility in terms of protecting liberal democracy around the world. I mean, itself, it looks unstable. The institutions are unstable. There's always a potential for someone like Trump to come back and to take over. And also, I mean, in the 1990s, there might have been quite some enthusiasm for markets and liberalization and deregulation and so on and so forth. And the notion of market efficiency was very strong. But I think at least since 2008, there's a more and more popular discourse about the failures of the market and the shortcomings of the market. And at the same time, 9/11 and post 9/11, the failure of Obama also to close Guantanamo and so on, you know, torturing and so on, has undermined the legitimacy of these claims for liberal democracy and spreading liberal democracy. So I think it's getting more and more difficult for a president or for an administration to make this kind of point. But perhaps climate change and pushing the climate agenda might be one way to restore faith in the leadership of the US. But I agree. I think much of this will play out in the antagonism with China. And it's no longer just one superpower, but we have a bipolar opposition, which might even be helpful in the end for the US.
Okay, so let's look at this now from an EU perspective. So we've got the US, who our perception of them has changed. As you say, they're no longer the big brother, if you will, who'll step in and protect the values of the West from whoever may be attacking them. What can Biden and his administration do, other than obviously climate change is the uniting idea for the left at the moment, the way I see it, and certainly the way a lot of people I've been speaking to see it. But what can Biden do to regain that trust? Because rejoining the Paris Agreement and the WHO, it's not enough. You know, these are logical steps that had to happen on day one. So what can this new administration do to try and rebuild these relationships? Because the EU, as I'm sure you're aware, they have the new trade deal with China, which Biden begged them not to agree to until he got into office. They ignored him. They've made the deal with China. It seems the EU are, for one of the first times, looking east. What can the Biden administration do to reestablish that tight relationship there used to be?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are limitations to that. I mean, there are obviously very material factors at play, you know, and economic factors at play, and economic interests also in tightening the transatlantic relationships. But I think, again, the cultural and soft power relationships have been underestimated, and rebuilding this kind of trust and rebuilding the notion of common values and so on is difficult, given that these values have oftentimes served also as fig leaves and you know, ways to shield away from view these harder interests and economic interests. So yeah, this has given rise, I think, to a certain cynicism vis-a-vis also human rights discourses and so on that somehow need to be restored, and it's very difficult. Yeah.
Okay. I think it's fair to say that a lot of eyes have been opened to what the US have been doing over the last number of decades. I mean, their involvement in Central America and in Latin America, in the Middle East. In a way, you could say that did we turn a blind eye to these goings on in the past in Europe? Did we pretend we didn't know what was happening? Do you think it's fair to say that the European eyes are opening now to the true nature of the US?
I think there's been an awareness of this and a critical discourse all along. I mean, just in the recent decades, if you think of the Iraq War, and so there were massive protests, and not just in intellectual circles or the academe, but also, you know, on the streets. So there's been an awareness, and there's been a critique of Reaganism, and, you know, the US as a police, as a world police, and so on. This reaches back a couple of decades, but. Yeah, I think you're right. This discussion is growing in strength, and I'm somehow divided about what the best strategic ways to think about this. Because on the one hand, yes, I mean, the US, if you think of liberal democracy or liberalism and the discourses of liberalism, they've always hidden from view exploitation, right, and discrimination, and worse than exploitation, yeah, and genocides and so on. But on the other hand, they contain the kernel of emancipation. I mean, the liberal idea and the Enlightenment, I think, more broadly speaking, has an emancipatory vision which, drives emancipation as well, and claims for participation and political rights and economic rights and social rights. So I think sometimes the left and parts of academia are also rejecting out of hand these Enlightenment discourses as naive and a cover-up, where in fact they are very important values. And I think the universalism that is contained is not just a weakness. Of course, I mean, we have to look at it very critically. And if we think of colonization and imperialism and the way that these discourses have been used. But we need some kind of an idealism or ideals, I think, to try and attain to and hold people accountable to, because if we don't, then these large-scale discourses fragment. And I don't think that's necessarily an emancipatory vision of the future.
No, you're absolutely right. There's been a massive lack of accountability, as long as I can remember, in international politics and foreign affairs. So we absolutely need to start, we need to start honing in and holding people responsible for the things they've done in the past and the things they continue to do right up until today. And America is right up at the top of that list with the other world powers.
That's, if I can just interrupt you, that's why I think your project is so interesting. Because we need these institutions at a larger scale, not just economic institutions, but also civil society institutions and political institutions, to hold people accountable, basically, and to upscale certain discourses of social justice, for example, even to a global scale, really. But it doesn't seem to be the moment we're in right now. But I was wondering, I mean, if you look at the pandemic and the way that it's being portrayed in the media, looks like a very nationalistic story. I find it very difficult to find, for example, a map of the EU and all the cases in the EU. It looks like the cases were just a national story, right? You have the German cases and the German curve, and then you have the US curve and the French curve, but there's no European curve. And what I noticed in this process, looking at this unfold, is also we don't have a European media landscape. We just have national media. And I think this is something that is problematic when we think of European identity and European civil society. So I think we need some kind of a theory also and a practice of upscaling. And I think I see your project as part of this.
Well, I'm glad to hear you say that. That's exactly what we're trying to do. We want to be a voice for progressives, for the left across Europe. As far as we're concerned, Europeans are Europeans. It doesn't matter where you're from, you know. And it is an interesting one, the pandemic, on this point that you brought up, because it really did take a step back towards, there was some real nationalist rhetoric and sentiment coming out from world leaders who up until then did not sound like that, from what I had heard, you know. And I think there were some unfair comparisons made, people talking about countries in the European Union and comparing them to the likes of New Zealand. You're like, okay, New Zealand are islands, you know, they can shut off their borders with no issues and they can contain a virus. Europe should now be Europe. We shouldn't be looking at, as you say, the German number of cases, the French number of cases, the Spanish number of cases. I think it's an interesting idea.
But there's, of course, a major tension, which is also important, I think, to remember on the left and also in major discourses, is that the critique from the right is not totally off. I mean, if you compare right-wing critique and left-wing critique post-2008 global financial crisis, the essence of the critique is against globalization, basically. And so I think there is something there that would make people afraid of upscaling to a European level as well, right? If local populations are somehow deracinated or feel, you know, like they're culturally unrooted or so. So we have to take consideration of that as well. But it's something that has been done before. If you think of the US, of course, the federal state didn't always exist. I mean, obviously this was a colonial project, but of multiple colonies that at some point, given economic and political interests, most of all, even though it's portrayed as a cultural story from the retrospective angle, has led to this kind of upscaling, which I don't see any reasons why that shouldn't exist in Europe as well. But anyways, I didn't want to derail our conversation.
No, that's all right. We can touch on everything here. That's absolutely fine. Yeah, like I completely agree. I think we do need further European integration. Now, the European Union has displayed what I would call political naivety and some of those issues have come to the fore in the last number of years. You're looking at the veto issue between Hungary and Poland, essentially holding certain policies hostage until they get what they want. This was an issue that the EU should have been able to see coming. And I'd like to get your opinion on this as well, because it seemed at the time when the EU was establishing itself that as soon as nations were to join, the only way is forward, the only way is democracy, the only way is further unity. And that hasn't been the case. And I'd love to get your opinion on whether you think we need to go back and rewrite some things, or we need to rethink the European Union project. What's your opinion on that?
I don't know if that's very mainstream. I guess it is. I think it should not just be an economic project, but a political and social project as well. And it can't hold as an economic project only, as a monetary union or a common market. I mean, there are too many tensions that grow out of this, which will undermine the political project. So there needs to be political will. I think we're seeing some of that, some of it in opposition to Trump, some of it in terms of trying to tackle the climate crisis. But again, the climate crisis is also a political economy issue. It's also about inequality. So it has to be addressed as such. If it just looks like the elite is trying to ram through its progressive agenda, if it's perceived as such at the local scale, I think this is a major problem. So there are deep tensions that have to be resolved somehow.
Absolutely. Hopefully we can go some way to contributing to clarifying the message and making communication on the left a bit better in Europe. But anyway, let's take it back across the Atlantic. So I think it's fair to say the US it's as polarized as it's ever been in my lifetime, that's for sure. Now, a lot of people are looking to Biden to reunite the country in the hope that this will then kick on and re-establish international relations and be able to get their foreign policy back on track. But has the US ever truly been not polarized in the last number of decades? How do you see that?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. The U.S., after all, is a project that was built on slavery and the expulsion of the native population. So, how could a project like this not lead to a polarized society? Yes, there have been also after the Civil War in the 1860s, there have been discourses and narratives of reconciliation. Right? There are also multicultural discourses of how everyone can participate. And I don't think they should be rejected out of hand. Even though, even on the left, there are criticisms of multiculturalism, again, as trying to appease relationships which in fact shouldn't so naively be portrayed and so on and so forth. So it comes with a lot of baggage as well. But I think the US has always been a polarized country, but at certain times, polarization didn't matter as much. And sometimes the axis of polarization shifted. And after the Second World War, especially after the New Deal in the 1930s, the response to the Great Depression, there was what Krugman, for example, calls the Great Compression. Right? There was a compression of wages, of inequalities until the 1970s, which led to less polarization also in the institutions, and that led to more reaching out across the aisle, right? Republicans and Democrats were able to bring about policy change. Yeah? But we shouldn't forget who was included was basically just white male Protestants. And so sometimes we tend to look back nostalgically at the New Deal order because it was able to raise wages and lead to stable jobs and so on, and social benefits and all that. But it did so just to a minority. of the majority society. And as soon as women and minorities pushed into that, we had, well, basically the 1970s, 1980s, first social unrest, and then reorganization of the political project and the rise of neoliberalization processes and the undoing of all these social benefits and so on. So there have been moments where polarization was outside of the core demos, I'd say, but the polarization was always there. Yeah. So we have to think about social projects where that can somehow be more inclusive and still be democratic. And that, I think, is a major challenge.
Yeah, absolutely. And no less so due to the polarization, not just of the nation, but the complete split in the Senate. Now, how much of an impact will the state of Congress have in Biden's ability to get anything done? As you said, now we have midterm elections in 2 years. Historically, the midterm elections favor the administration, but we can't rely on that. So
no, normally midterms don't favor. I mean, normally it's a backlash. Normally the midterm is the administration loses unified government. I mean, if you look at the last 2 decades or so, this is where, and also if you think of the Clinton attempt of a health reform, he got defeated in the midterm and wasn't able to pull it through. And that's something we see quite often, and it's obviously intentional. And some political scientists have said this is ultimately the purpose of the American political system, is to avoid concentration of power. And so you could think of it as a checks and balance, not in the sense of, executive, legislative, judicative branch, but a sort of temporal checks and balance, which after 2 years leads to a rethinking, right? And a reorientation of the political project. But that is very short term. And it makes it almost impossible to have long-term policy change.
Yeah. Well, this is and a follow-up to that, because it is, I certainly could be seen as a temporal checks and balances, but is that necessary when it's a 4-year term? I mean, 4 years it's not the longest presidential term you're going to see around the world. And only having 2 years to get anything done in a Senate that's 50-50, how do they get anything done? I know they have the deciding vote if things end up 50-50, but that's unlikely. Everything will end up with everyone staying on their side,
I think this critique is justified, but I think the Constitution needs to be seen in the context from which it arose, where the federal state wasn't as important yet, because this is pre-industrial revolution. I mean, the commercial capacities and the military capacities of the American state at the convention in 1787 was relatively minor. I mean, yes, it did get the right to for coinage, to have a currency, right? It did have certain commercial capacities, but this grew substantially in the Industrial Revolution, especially after the American Civil War, after the 1860s. And so I think in the 18th century, the more dominant discussion was about trying to avert a lapse, a falling back into a monarchy. I think the biggest fear was that there would be someone who could undo the checks and balances and rule as a king. I think this was the major concern. And of course, they couldn't have foreseen the kinds of longer term needs there are for planning or for organizing an industrial society and post-industrial society. So I think that's the reason. But of course, I mean, this leads to gridlock. And to a stalemate. And you could say, well, that's a great thing, because nobody ever gets to go completely berserk into one or the other direction. But in a way, that's not true either. I mean, if you look at the kind of polarization and the kinds of political ideologies that have formed in the last decades or so, they are quite extremist nonetheless, right? And I think it's also interesting how people, now that Trump has left the office, say, well, the American institutions held and they were stable and they worked, because I think we really closely escaped the very real potential of an autocratization under Trump. And I think the only reason this didn't happen was that that Biden was elected because had he been in office another 4 years, I think the way that he has redone the state would have been very difficult to undo.
Absolutely. I think you're completely right in that 4 years of Trump was rough. I can't imagine how rough it was for the people in the States, certainly anyone who felt the wrath of his barbarism. But another 4 years of Trump would have been truly catastrophic to that nation. He was willing to do anything, say anything, let people do anything on his word to try and overturn an election that he so clearly lost. He was lying from election night on. He tried to come out and say they won it. So I think there's certainly a bullet dodged there.
But yes, yeah.
No, please.
No, but the fascinating thing, if you want to call it fascinating, is that nonetheless 74 million voted for him. And I think in part it's opportunism. In part, I think it's also this politics of revenge, of fear, of recognition. He's recognizing the difficult times that some folks in the US are having, especially the white middle classes of this post-World War era that was benefiting from the Great Compression and that has been losing out since the 1980s. So there are very real grievances, of course, that he's not addressing in terms of policy change, but addressing in terms of recognition and seeing the pain, but he's catering to it not through social policy, etc., but he's catering to it through this fear and fear mongering and all that. So yeah,
absolutely. So one last question following on from that. As you're saying, Trump did. It's not like Trump took the power with just by any means necessary. Millions and millions of people voted for him. So what can we do in Europe because as you said, sorry, just to frame the question, he didn't try and enact social policy to unite the people. He spoke very clearly to one group who had been seeing losses over the last number of decades. So what can we do in Europe to prevent this polarization, this extreme polarization, but in the right way? How can we bring people together from the left, from the right, from the center, to cooperate, to live together, so that we don't end up with a tyrannical leader like Trump so nearly was?
Yeah, I think, there's a lot of discussion about echo chambers and filter bubbles and media polarization. I think that is somewhat misled. I think this is an amplification of what's going on. Yes, it is important, of course, what kinds of media people consume. And if you have radicalized media, that is a major problem, that only just portrays things from one perspective and overemphasizes and so on. But I think the root cause is that of inequality. I think as soon as inequality becomes too deep, there's Robert Reich has once called it a snap back or a snap break, he says, I think. And it's very difficult to pinpoint when that break happens. But I think at some point it seems illegitimate that certain people are ruling. If there's a certain group that almost appears like an aristocracy, if you have institutions that are they pretend to be meritocratic, but they're ultimately not. If that kind of inequality happens, if the culture polarizes in such a way, then it becomes much more easier, I think, for demagogues to play the fear card, right? And to kindle the flames of anxiety, cultural anxiety, and so on. But I think the root cause is physical and even more so economic stability and security. And so I think this is the major thing that needs to be addressed.
Perfect. Professor Vormann, we're going to leave it there. Thanks a million for joining me. It was an absolute pleasure. Really insightful conversation.
Thank you. It was great fun.
Thank you very much. Take care.